Hello everyone, and thanks for dropping by and for returning to the old world. So today we're going to be talking about my hopes for Warhammer the Old World when it finally gets released. Now, I have talked in a separate video as to why I'm excited about the release of the game, but today, what do I hope this game will achieve? Well, before we can start on any of that really, the first thing we need to do is think about what we already know. And this is just some of the information really gleaned from the sporadic releases on the Warhammer community website. So what do we know? We know roughly the time frame in which the game will be set. And that's going to be the time of the three emperors, several hundred years before the end times. We know that Warhammer the Old World will be a rank and flank square base game, much like the old Warhammer Fantasy Battle was. We know that our existing collections should be usable in the new game. That's a bonus to start with, really, but we'll go into that in a second. We know that the game's going to be inspired by various Warhammer Fantasy Battle editions, hopefully taking the best from all of them while knocking down the excesses that were in place in the various editions. And we also have some clues from the maps as to the geographical locations of a number of the factions, including things like the High Elves being a bit more prevalent in the Old World. But overall, we know very little. And we know pretty much nothing about the mechanics of the game itself. So, what would I like to see when this game eventually comes out? Well, the first thing for me is not really about the game itself. It's more of an overarching principle, really, and that's accessibility. Now, I know there's been other people make videos about accessibility of Games Workshop games in the past, and people have commented particularly things around like Horus Heresy, and for years how that's been Forge World only, for example. But accessibility is going to be a massive thing, I think, for Warhammer the Old World, because this is a game that's not existed officially for quite some time now. The scene will need recreating, and fresh blood will need to be brought into the game. So the game needs to be accessible. Now, I think we can take heart to an extent, having just mentioned Horus Heresy, from the fact that a load of figures are now being produced in plastic. It's not just Forge World resin being the only official models available, forcing people to either spend vast sums of money or to look for alternative sources for their models, be it 3D printing or whatever. Keeping on the accessibility theme, I'd also like to see the size of armies and units get smaller. So a big thing by 8th edition was the absolutely monumental growth of your rank and file units because of the horde mechanic. And for a unit to be effective on the battlefield, needing 20 guys is fine, needing 30 guys is fine. Needing 50, which will probably involve buying 5 packs of 10 troops, is a huge commitment in money and time with all the building, painting, etc. Just to get one of your core units up to a size where it's not going to survive longer than a turn on the battlefield. The combined with the points creep that happened through the later editions of Warhammer, where the standard game went from being 2,000 to 2,400 points and models became cheaper, so armies were getting bigger anyway. Huge blow to the size of armies, which when combined with then you've got to get a unit's going to be 50 models or whatever. For a new player's perspective, that's going to be very hard to get into, I think. So this kind of leads us to pitching our armies as being something somewhere between 8th edition and the Hero Hammer editions. And I think power level has to be pitched from there as well. Personally, I'd be looking for armies that were balanced, and if you took a view from maybe a historical standpoint, that the armies would appear somewhere in the region of what you'd expect these forces to look like. So combined arms of artillery, infantry, cavalry, supported by a small number of characters that will make a difference but won't determine the battle by themselves. All the elements of the army have to work together. That's what I'd like to see. And I suppose really while we're on this topic of large units and Hero Hammer and the like, from an accessibility perspective, actually what I'd really like to see is if you buy a box of figures, that box is an effective unit, not having to buy 5 of them, not having to looking at Chaos Warriors, then go off and buy like upgrade sprues to actually give them the weapon options that you want, stuff like that. So accessibility is going to be really important, and that is my key hope for the new game. Okay, but what about the game itself? Well, having said it's great that old models will be usable, I'd like to see some new models, and I'd like to see Games Workshop challenge the aesthetic of the game. I am planning on making future videos about the aesthetic of some different factions, so I'll keep this relatively simple, but from a human perspective, a game set 200 years before the end times, which is when our existing collections are based, technology levels will doubtlessly have changed. Humans are short-lived, ambitious creatures, certainly when compared to some of the longer living races in the Warhammer world, or even your classic fantasy tropes. So I wouldn't expect them to be armed and equipped in the same way during the time of the Three Emperors. Looking from a historical perspective, just look at the last few generations. Look at the way our grandparents dressed when they were young, how we dressed when we were young, and if you're a little bit older, how the young of today are dressing. Fashions are changing generation by generation, so I wouldn't expect models representing troops 200 years prior to the end times to look the same. So it's a really good opportunity, I think, for Games Workshop to challenge the aesthetic of the game, but to look to do it in a way that's compatible with how the game looked when it was Warhammer Fantasy Battle, rather than going down the steampunk angle like some of the Age of Sigmar stuff has. And that as a quick aside is an off-putting thing for me. I'm not a big fan of the aesthetic of that game. Okay, so there are a couple of points. It's kind of addressed what the game will look like, but I think the next two will address this a bit more firmly. First of which is magic. Now, it's a fantasy game, can't get away from magic being there, be it spells, magic items, or whatever. What I'd like to see is for magic to be a supporting function, part of the combined arms element of a successful army. Now, I appreciate armies like the dwarves don't have access to cavalry, they don't have access to spellcasters, so they're more artillery infantry combos. But I don't want to see a game where it's all about casting your big doom spell, and if that goes off, you get huge rewards from it. And being able to do that every single turn, potentially, needs to be a supporting element. A buff here, a debuff there, pinging some wounds off here, killing a couple of models there. And if there is the big doom spell, then limits on how much that can do, or how often it can be attempted in a game. Perhaps drawing some kind of inspiration from the Total War computer games, where you've got a Winds of Magic count. Your big doom spell takes a lot of your Winds of Magic for the entire game out, so you've got to be careful about when you use it, or if you use it at all. And my final point, really, about what I would like to see is some changes to artillery. By 8th edition, artillery, particularly cannons, which had become increasingly prevalent with more and more factions having access to cannons or cannon equivalents, they were just so accurate and so dependable. One, to an extent, it took some of the skill out of using them, but also made them really, really effective tools that you couldn't not have them. I'm reminded of a particular incident in an event my club at the time was running. I ended up paired up against a Demons of Chaos army. Now, I was never a Demons player, so forgive me, I don't know the names of all the models and units that they had, but they had a weapon that was effectively a cannon and chariot combined. And I looked at my opponent, I looked at his army, I looked at my army, and I knew that, quite frankly, it was a bad matchup. His army was going to beat mine, and that's the way that's the way it goes sometimes. But I knew that if I got first turn, then I had a very good chance of taking his artillery out, and then I could turn my artillery onto his infantry, do a few wounds, do a bit of damage, and it might keep me in the game for a little bit. As it was, that didn't happen. I didn't get first turn, and with laser-like precision, his 2 guns opened up on my 2 guns, wiped them both out, and then I had nothing that could convincingly keep my opponent's army off of mine, and I kept going as long as I could, but it was just an absolute thrashing. But we are talking here about Renaissance artillery. Yes, there's magic in the world, but this is relatively early gunnery, and that sort of level of pinpoint precision on a ball that's ill-fitting in an unrifled barrel, I don't really buy it that the guns would be that dependable. So I think they need to be looked at a little bit going forward. Again, to really just make them a supporting element to the overall game, with no individual element in an army overpowering the other. Nice and balanced, plenty of accessibility, allowing new players to get into the game, while allowing those longbeards amongst us to drag our collections out of retirement and just enjoy the setting, enjoy the stories once more, and push some plastic around the table. Thank you very much for stopping by. These are obviously just my thoughts on where I hope some of the aspects of the game will go. I look forward to seeing what actually happens if and when the game actually gets released. But as I say, thanks for stopping by. This is Return to the Old World. Have a great day.